conversation and that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure not only to be here with you all and back in amongst British comrades to talk about what's happening in Europe and obviously the DiEM25 project for a radical alternative, but I am saddened, I must say, by the fact that we're doing so under these circumstances. But then again, between us socialists, old and new, let's be honest, when have there been better circumstances? Our history is one of continuous struggle, some moments of hope and plenty also of disappointment. So, but of course, I don't want to put too much of a pessimistic note to it. Throughout history, there have been numerous examples that we can point to as signs of hope. And by happy coincidence or not, this meeting today happens to coincide with the anniversary of the Paris Commune, which I guess most of you will probably have heard about, the revolutionary socialist government that ruled Paris for 2 months in 1871. Yeah, that long ago. Why do I mention it? I don't mention it because we should try to replicate it per se, least of all because we live in an entirely different world right now, albeit one that is also very similar to the world of 1871, at least in terms of the power distribution in our societies, between the haves and the have-nots. The reason I mention it is because we badly need inspiration, and I think as Slavoj Žižek has been saying all along, the crisis of today is not only a crisis of capitalism, it's also a crisis of imagination. So we cannot forget historical moments like the Paris Commune and others across the globe. We must learn from the examples of the past, not just to inform our theoretical understanding of what the hell is going on today, but more importantly, in my view, to help us determine practically, what to do and how to do it. Because we mustn't forget the questions we ask ourselves every single day, and the reason why we get up in the morning, I should think, are precisely the same questions that people before us were asking themselves, people who also struggled immensely in order to fight for the same ideals that I think most of us are fighting for. But to go back to the present circumstances with which I started my intervention, it is precisely these circumstances, the circumstances created by a system that's designed to further impoverish the poor and enrich the rich, that we must change. The question is, how do we do it? But before I get to that, I think we first have to realize that the oppression of today isn't purely physical. It isn't simply manifested as physical violence. People are oppressed in other ways as well. When I look around and I see people at home, watching Netflix on their sofas, eating their takeaway and blowing off some steam with each other during the weekends, I wonder how we can transform this passivity into something that can be system changing. And obviously, don't get me wrong, I'm not about to go on a tirade against entertainment and so on. I think it's perfectly needed in many ways, but at the same time, right-wing propaganda has been so strong insofar as it has made good people believe that socialism is the enemy of individual freedom. Of course, we all know the exact opposite is true. Socialists, work together to create the material conditions under which people can truly be free, without the rigid constraints that really existing capitalism imposes on their lives. And since I mentioned individual freedom, let me add something here too. As Chomsky has noted, the idea of individual freedom is a good idea. I mean, do you have the freedom to drive on the left side of the road if you feel like it? Do you have the freedom to run around malls shooting an assault rifle? That's what it means to go to a public event or a public area without wearing a mask. That is threatening people's lives, seriously. That's not individual freedom. That's an acceptable license, as he put it. Just give me 1 second. There's a dog that is trying to leave my room and I need to get her out. Apologies. Sorry, it's my dog, and she was here, and I had to leave her out because she was making too much noise. But as I was saying, nobody accepts the kinds of things that Chomsky is talking about. If you want a choice not to wear a mask, that's okay, but stay at home, don't endanger others. But that's another question that I'm not going to go into right now. But besides creating this passivity through entertainment, as I was talking about, as well as precarity, people not having decent quality jobs enough to be able to afford their rent and their basic needs, we mustn't forget surveillance as well as a means through which the powerful keep people at bay, contained and afraid. I just came back from a small town in the south of France, as I was telling Paul earlier, called Fehr, which is ruled by a right-wing mayor. It's a small town of 5,000 people. And in this town, there's a group of people who got together to set up an independent local newspaper. It's essentially a newsletter that they send to their subscribers, tackling the major issues that they're experiencing in the area where they live. And these people self-organized. They saw a chance and acted to challenge the mayor on the fact that the local government has just spent thousands of euros of public money on surveillance cameras situated throughout the town. You know, all these people have jobs, albeit mostly part-time jobs, and in their free time they have fun together since they're friends, and at the same time they're fighting for something that they believe in. They even took it a step further. Recently, they were telling me when I was there, they got together as a citizen list to run in the local elections and actually almost made it. They lost only by a couple of votes, and they will try again next time, you know. But it's a perfect example of how you can get together as individuals and collectively create something out of it that challenges the powers that be, wherever that may be, you know, whether it's in Wellingborough or whether it's in Fehr in the south of France or anywhere else in actual fact. But to go back to socialism, we have to continuously remind ourselves of what socialism is and what it is that we're fighting against and what we're fighting for, namely the social ownership of the means of production. Now, if you go out there and you say this to most people, they'll turn around and tell you to bugger off, and they'd probably be right to do so. Because while it is true that we're fighting against the illegitimate use of power, the unjust and corrupt concentration of capital in the hands of the few, you know, what we at DiEM have been calling socialism for the rich and austerity for the rest, we have to remember that this fight knows no borders. This is a fight that requires internationalism. Socialism, you know, without internationalism, as some political parties in Europe have been advocating, is worse than an illusion. It's a danger to progress. We need to link up arms across the continent. We need to talk. We need to act. We need to use the existing institutions that exist and plan out how to use them to our advantage, to occupy those spaces. And if we're to succeed, we have to speak also a language that people understand. It's not good enough to simply be right. I think this is one of the big pitfalls of the left, in the sense that we always think we're right and that's somehow going to resolve every single problem in the world. It's not, comrades, it's not. We might have the ideas, and our opponents, they might have the machine. As the policy director of a center-left Belgian political party told me in 2019 when we were trying to run for the elections in this country. But, you know, ideas will always prevail, and machines, well, you know, they break down and die. Our job is not to repair the machine that breaks down, but to build our own unbreakable machine that is not afraid to challenge and ultimately take power. But we need to understand where power is situated across all levels and whether such power is illegitimate or otherwise. So it is our job as true internationalists to unite and take that power and put it into the service of people across the world, not private interests who do not give a shit, sorry to say, about you or I, about cleaners, nurses, teachers, factory workers, and so on. There is an alternative, you know, this Thatcher right idea that there is no such thing as there is no alternative and that there is no such thing as society. It's not true that there is an alternative. In fact, there are many. But we have to say goodbye to the never-ending circle of discussion that permeates throughout leftist movements. At some point, we need to be able to know how to act, because without action, our ideas will remain forever in the realm of the intellect and never materialize into something actual that people can point to and say, you see, socialism works. The left can indeed work. But let me talk about the European Union for a bit now. And let me be crystal clear about it. You know, there is no true European Union, comrades. It does not exist. It just does not exist. European and Union are simply two words that have been put together to give people the idea to give people out there, you know, the idea and the impression that we have a united Europe. And you don't need me to tell you that, but the truth, sadly, is far from it. You know, and you don't need to look very far to verify that claim. We have a monetary union. We have a common currency with the euro, obviously not in the UK. You have the pound still, but we certainly don't have a political union. And in the absence of the latter, of the political union, there's no point really referring to a European Union, because it will only become united when it turns into a federal democratic Europe, which is what must happen if we're to move forward. Because the current system that we have with the EU has been failing. And the reason why DiEM was launched, you know, we've always been saying the EU will be democratized or it will disintegrate. The point is not to break it apart. The point is to look at it and say, how can we transform this European Union so instead of serving private interests, it serves the interests of people everywhere? You know, that's really the key question. So at the moment, you know, it feels a little bit like looking at a blue painting and calling it green. You can repeat the claim that it's green 1,000 times. It still doesn't change the fact that it's blue, which is precisely what the European Commission has done with its Green Deal. There is nothing green about it. Instead, what we have is a clear this union. Just look at what happened in 2008 with this century's Great Depression, what happened with the crushing of Greece in 2015, which is also what led to the DiEM25 being created, what happened with the EU-Turkey deal, and the general approach to migration and refugees, and also now what's happening with the vaccines. I mean, the examples are numerous. One could go on and on and on and on. So those two words, European Union, are to mean anything at all, and here I include European non-EU countries as well. The EU, as we advocate, must be politically integrated, it must be federal, and it has to absolutely 100% be democratic and transparent. And in such a configuration, you know, if the EU is to be a force for good also outside in the world, not just within our borders, it must stop selling arms to other countries, you know, and instead support democratic movements where they emerge, as opposed to what we currently have, which is precisely the opposite. You know, we have EU member states which are often more interested in pursuing aggressive foreign policy by directly or indirectly through the United States or NATO bombing targets in the name of peace and security. And since I mentioned the vaccines, what's the EU doing now about it all? You know, we have this thing called the EU Recovery Fund, as you might have heard about. You know, it sounds good, doesn't it? But I mean, is it really good, or are we all being taken for a ride here? I think for me, it's time to start calling it what it really is, which is the EU Decomposition Fund. And I'll just briefly try to explain why I think that is. First of all, you know, we can't talk about a EU recovery fund when only a meager 380 billion euros will come in the form of grants. You know, this is half of the total amount of the entire fund through this 380 billion. To put it into perspective, 350 billion, you know, something like that, is around the same amount as the total gross domestic product of a country like Norway. It sounds like a lot, but it really isn't when you consider that the EU Recovery Fund is meant to be distributed to every single EU member state in order to help them tackle and to offset the costs that they had to incur as a result of this coronavirus pandemic. So it's very, very, very little money. It's not going to help anyone that actually needs that money right now. It's the equivalent of actually giving money to the poor on conditions that make it impossible for them to pay it back. In other words, it really is a form of blackmail and economic and financial imprisonment, not to mention political subjugation. And, you know, a couple of weeks ago, it was the anniversary of, not the anniversary, but there was the 1 year since the pandemic hit. Anniversary makes it sound like it was a good thing, which it wasn't. So let me take that back. But, you know, you fast forward a year and there's been no single European Union country that has seen any money whatsoever, zero. And it's unlikely that they will even see it this year. You know, according to the Commission, the European Commission itself, you know, EU countries have until April 30th of this year to submit, and I quote, their national recovery and resilience plans, setting out their reform, investment agendas until 2026. This means that end quote, this means that the money will only be disbursed, in other words, be given to these countries once the plans have been reviewed and approved. So in the end, the question is, recovery for whom? Is this money going to go to small and medium-sized businesses and people who actually need it? I very much doubt it. I actually was reading the other day this EU Council press release, which was dated from February 11th of this year, which states, and I quote again, support will be linked to country-specific recommendations under the European semester, which identifies central challenges for each member state to address to strengthen competitiveness. Now, again, to the majority of people out there, this means absolutely nothing. And there's a good reason for it, because it's meant to be difficult to understand. To break down the jargon, what it means is that the money lent to EU countries will depend on whether they implement the recommendations set by the EU. Now, don't get me wrong, if the grant money, this 380 billion euros, was going to be given on conditions that it was spent on things like public education, healthcare, and so on, things that people need, fine. But that's just not the case. We all know that. The press release goes on to state that the money will only be disbursed, quote, upon, quote, achievement of the agreed milestones and targets. And the same press release states that only 13% of the money will be pre-financed. The other 87% of the money will arrive way too late and pending an assessment on whether the plans follow the EU recommendations. So what do we think about this as DiEM? If you look closely, the EU is essentially weaponizing this pandemic in order to push through a reform agenda that ultimately aims to benefit the rich and the powerful, all the while selling it as a recovery plan. It's unbelievable. And I'm in Brussels, I live here. If you look around, if you go to the European Parliament Square, everywhere around here in the bubble, as they call it, it's unbelievable. Everybody's like super happy about the fact that they believe this is going to solve every person's problem, in the European Union, and that it's a sign of integration of the project. It is not. It's the sign of its decomposition, as I started by saying. And it's really unbelievable how this propaganda somehow permeated throughout every sphere of influence in this city, but not just in this city, also elsewhere across Europe. In other words, money is being used as a tool, just like it was in 2008, to shape society in the interests of the ruling establishment. An establishment which, as you all know, does not have the interests of people and the planet at their heart. In other words, it's, again, socialism for the rich and austerity for the rest. Not to repeat myself too much, but while people here in the EU bubble, as I mentioned, in Brussels, are tapping each other on the back for what they claim to be the most wonderful achievement, the reality could not be further from the truth. In actual fact, they even rebranded the EU Recovery Fund and turned it into what they now call Next Generation EU. And this fund will do absolutely nothing to prevent the suffering that people are going through right now across Europe. So it's not that the EU is going slowly in the right direction, as some people have been claiming, but that it's going fast in the wrong direction. There are people who cannot afford to put food on the table, and this is also in the UK, not just in the continent. There are people who cannot afford medicine and hospital treatment, people who are like totally isolated and alone, people who can't find good quality jobs, and people who are being evicted as we speak because their salaries are not good enough to cover their essential expenses. This is the result of 40 years of financialization. This is the result of 40 years of essentially right-wing governments favoring big business at the expense of what's good for the people. And this is something that we have to think practically about. We know what the problems are, but how do we tackle it? How do we get organized and we challenge this power, which is so absolute sometimes? And the example that I gave about Fehr, this local town in the south of France, if you remember, it's just a good example of how you don't always have to look at the big picture. You don't have to think, I have to change Europe, and because the task is just too big. It's just too enormous. You have to also think, what can I do in my local community? What can I do that is going to make a relevance for people's lives? And it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's organizing a protest and getting an issue on the map, or something a bit more continuous. It's very important that we act. It's not, like I was saying, it's not just about thinking and discussing. It's about getting our hands together, getting our imaginations together, getting our thinking together, and really starting to make a difference and acting on things. Without that, I'm afraid we won't really move beyond that. And I'm almost done, but just a couple of more things. There was a news report recently in the Brussels Times referencing data from the November 2020 census, which is last year, which showed that the homeless population in Brussels has increased by 50% in the last 5 years. Now, this is not something that you're already not aware of. I mean, the same is happening everywhere across Europe, not to mention those people living under the poverty line. So when EU leaders talk about recovery, it's quite literally a slap in the face to all those whose lives depend on the EU and its member states doing its job properly. And that's just not happening. That's why DiEM25 exists, because we need to turn this European Union into a project that actually solves these problems and does not exacerbate them. In summary, what this shows, once again, is that the EU that we have today is simply not fit for purpose, which, don't get me wrong, and to leave no room for doubt, does not mean that I think we should, abandon the project. On the contrary, we need to radically democratize it so that it puts people first. The idea that, the only solution is being in this European Union, that is crap, that is not helping people, and leaving it, that is not, there has to be another way. And the DiEM way is to say, we need to fight for it. We need to fight to change it. We know it sucks. We know it really just, it's like a cartel of big business, but we have to do something about it. And if we don't, the only people that will take advantage from it will be the far right and the liberal establishment, as we call them. And, just to add one more thing here, the left, it needs to care about freedom, but also it needs to be internationalist, as I said earlier, because right now, if you look around, who's internationalizing? Capital is global, capital is international, and nationalists are internationalizing. I mean, even during the European elections campaign, Steve Bannon from the US, who was working with Trump before, was actually in Brussels to try and bring together all these nationalist parties across Europe in order to create a kind of, support network for nationalist far-right political parties, even with Nigel Farage as well and others. So that's happening. And what's the left been doing? Look at France with Mélenchon, La France Insoumise. They've basically been looking inwards. This is about French socialism. And look what was happening in Portugal with the left bloc. Very little solidarity for outside of the country. It was very much about, okay, Portuguese socialism. And what's happening, also with the Labour Party was different. I mean, now with Keir Starmer, everything is more or less just gone down the drain. There was a moment there with Corbyn where things could have really taken a turn for the better, but it was also very much vilified by the media, and there were many other factors which were contributing to the dysfunction of the party, not namely the fact that the party itself was acting against Corbyn himself. And anyways, what I'm saying is, if you look around Europe, all these national political parties on the left, instead of taking the route of internationalizing, they weren't doing that. They started sort of looking inward and retreating into the cocoon of the nation state, thinking that would resolve every single problem. Clearly, obviously, that doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. And as we said, we need to integrate. We need to work together. We need to link up arms. Struggles across the world, from the south, the global south, to the global north, in order to make a difference. So what does Europe, and to bring it to my final point here, what does Europe and its people need instead? What we're advocating is what we call a real Green New Deal for Europe that will transform our continent for good. This is an investment plan for which there is a plan on how to get it funded, and not that aberration that the European Commission as called the Green Deal. It's confusing because they're using the same language. It's very Orwellian, if you think about it, in terms of how they co-opt the language of the left in order to make it seem like they're selling the same thing, but in actual fact, they're selling something which is essentially poison. So that's what we're offering, is this Green New Deal for Europe. You can look it up on gndforeurope.com. I can also share it with you. It's a very comprehensive plan. I think the most comprehensive that I've certainly seen, and I don't say that as somebody who works for DiEM, I genuinely mean it. I would very much like to see another plan like it to prove me wrong. That is, a plan which has been drafted in order to pull Europe out of the twin crises of austerity and climate and environmental breakdown. Now, just to finalize, I just want to add that no single person has all the answers. It would be arrogant of me to be here and to say, I know everything and I'm telling you everything you need to know. Of course not. I'm just glad that we have been discussing as DiEM since 2016 what the problems are. We've done a great analysis of that. And we've come to some answers collectively, not just alone. And we know this, like I said, because we've been doing this work tirelessly over the last 5 years, 6 years, and 5.5 years now. And if there was another international movement like DiEM, because a lot of people say, oh yeah, DiEM is just breaking, the left and whatever. And I'm like, it isn't. The left is already split. The left is already split. Look at the Labour Party in the UK. Look at any left party in Europe, and you realize that there is no such thing as the left. I'm sorry to say it, but the left is really, there are pockets of the left, if you like, But the real left, that is not this kind of liberalized, neoliberalized version of it, is frankly very difficult to find. If you, I don't know how you'd point it out on a map even. So that's what DiEM stands for, is that original left, and we believe to be doing what's necessary. If we didn't, we wouldn't exist, and we would pack our bags and be like, well, that's better. We don't have to worry about all this political stuff, you know, and we can just let people get on with it. We exist precisely to challenge that nation-state approach to politics and to be the radical left that was once a beacon of hope for the world, but which, in my opinion, no longer exists. So that's it for me. Thank you, Paul, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about DiEM and also about the situation in Europe. I hope it was somewhat interesting for everyone here. And my colleague Johannes, I'm sure, will be happy to tell you more practically as well about how we operate and how you could get involved if you like to know more about the movement itself. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. I mean, it's an impossible topic, frankly, for you to, in half an hour or 20 minutes, to cover the whole issue of what's happening in Europe. I mean, we set you an impossible task, but I think you pulled out really well some very key themes about what's happening in Europe, and we'll touch on those, I'm sure, in the discussion that will follow. I'm now going to hand over to Johannes Fehr. Is that how you pronounce it? Fehr? Johannes Fehr. Welcome, Johannes, to this event. Just a little bit about you for people. You joined DiEM in 2016, so that must have been around about probably the same time that I did. So that's roughly, I suppose. I mean, the movement was founded in 2016, wasn't it? So you joined as an early supporter. Since then, you've been very politically active in Berlin and been organising political events, meetings, and moving around Europe. I mean, you're currently living in Portugal, as I understand it, but you will be moving back to Germany shortly. Since 2019, you've been a volunteer coordinator as an ex officio member of DiEM's coordinating collective. And in 2020, you were voted onto the board of Democracy in Europe, the German electoral wing of DiEM25. You might want to say something. I'm sure you may already have planned to say something. How they did in the recent? How did they stand in the recent elections, the local elections in Baden-Württemberg and Rhineland-Pfalz? And how's that project going? Be interested to know. Anyway, if you'd like to unmute yourself, it's now your turn.
Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation. Thanks also for David for this great, wrap up of the whole situation that we're in. I'm going to try to complement that a little bit with some personal points on where we are in Europe, and then also on what we are doing in DiEM25 and also in Demokratie in Europa that you just have been mentioning, and other electoral wings that we are developing. So what's happening in Europe, I think David has, as I said, covered it pretty well. But for me, since I'm at the moment in the situation to be in Portugal and wanting to move back to Germany, that has been proven quite difficult in the current situation to organize everything. I feel like back in the days when I was traveling outside of Europe, when I had to take care of a visa, when I had to, make sure this, now I may have to make sure I have a COVID test. The travel restrictions are not in place. I can go back, to Germany, and my partner is Portuguese, so she has even sometimes, some 3 weeks ago she couldn't have been flying from Portugal to Germany. So I think that shows us also, or me personally, it shows which situation we also could be in when the European Union wouldn't exist. So I think in that regard, and for us to move freely around in this political sphere, it has some great advantages, and that's why I fully, of course, agree with David that we shouldn't abandon the project, but we have to radically transform it And there, another personal example, I was living for the last 14 months in the Portuguese countryside in the north at the rural area in the Spanish, close to the Spanish border, in a very small village. We just said goodbye today, which was very emotional, to our small community there. And I have to say that those are, of course, great people, like everywhere around the world, but they face this challenge that they are they have a very old average there in the countryside. So those, and their kids, their grandkids, everybody is in Lisbon or even somewhere else in the European Union. In a lot of people there have you meet people in that village that have worked in France, worked in Switzerland, speak some French, some German, some English, were in Canada. And that, I think, shows that the current economic model that we are having, so capitalism, to describe it quite directly, is not working on the long term already. Not only in this crisis now, but on the long term. And I think that's what also the DiEM project is about. And I'm sure your group as well, to think about a suitable alternative. And of course, we're doing that transnationally. And I think that is both a great source of inspiration for us in DiEM25, but also, of course, a big challenge, because we are speaking in different languages. We have different political traditions that I got to know in my last 5 years in DiEM25 much closer than I would have had, otherwise. Our website, for example, has currently 11 languages, and it's a lot of work from a lot of volunteers working behind the scenes to try to keep the message coherent, but also translate, bring together these different cultures and political traditions, which is very inspiring to see. And I think those problems that David has been describing, and I just describe with this small example, and of course there are many more, are global, but especially in Europe, we have this kind of, I think, possibility, if we work well together, if we are successful with our project and our transnational approach, that we will tackle this problem together, because we are in this world together, and we have those problems, not even starting to speak about climate change or something like that. What is DiEM about, or what? We have already been mentioning that we work transnationally, all of that. David also has mentioned the Green New Deal for Europe. That is our program, or part of our program, actually. It has some more components, but it's our biggest kind of chunk, and also campaign that we took after we went, because in 2016, we started as only a movement when I joined. And in the meantime, we took a decision together in an all-member vote saying we want to establish electoral wings, which means we have parties currently in Italy, France, Germany, where I'm also directly involved, and Greece. And those parties are not, spin-offs or, associated with that. No, they are part of our movement. They're a tool of our movement. And we want, with those parties, not, to go beyond only making movement work, campaigning, organizing on the streets, but also we want to make pressure to go into the parliaments and bring our agenda really to the ballot box. Of course, that's another really big project, because we need to, the party laws are quite different around Europe. We need to meet them. So we are working on all these things. The Greek electoral wing, where Johannes Varoufakis is, a member and a leader of, has already been quite successful and entered the national parliament. Mera 25 is the name. Paul, you have also been mentioned the German electoral wing. There we are really at the very beginning. We have competed in the European elections and got about 130,000 votes. But that's from there on, it's a hard road, and especially what we're doing in DiEM in general, we're trying to go more on the national level now, after the European elections, to also approach those national programs to the European Union. You know, most of the powers go between the governments on the national level. So that's what we're also now approaching and trying to make an impact. We have a project called People's Gatherings. It's about bringing people together, asking questions. It's similar to citizens' assemblies, but of course we have some particularities. And through those people's gatherings, we'll try to answer a set of questions on the national level and put together our programs with the help of the people and by reaching out, being present in the local neighborhoods and so on. To feed then into our programs and also into the electoral wings programs, and then hopefully one day making it to the ballot box, making it to the parliaments, and even if we're really doing well, putting our agenda in place against the various internationals that David has been mentioning already. One of our very basic building bricks are DiEM spontaneous collectives. And I've heard from Paul a little bit that maybe in Wellingborough, there might also be the possibilities, if some of you become or are members of DiEM25 or become members of DiEM25, to start such a local collective, which is one of our basic building bricks, basically. We have those local collectives around Europe. They have their independent remit and can self-organize on topics that are important for them locally. We try to support them with, for example, the Campaign Accelerator project. We also try to bring the Green New Deal for Europe that David has been mentioning to the local level, to these groups. And I really, recommend for you to maybe get involved there. Julia is also, of course, a member and even a very active one in the UK. So you can always reach out to her or to us. I'm always reachable under volunteer@diem25.org. So there you can reach me if you're interested or have any questions. I'll just put this in the chat for now. Before finishing, I wanted to mention two more short points. One is the Progressive International that has been mentioned by Paul in the beginning, which is our internationalist Beyond Europe project, and not only ours. We are only one organization that is part of it, and there's organizations from across the globe part of it, because we even think, or we know, that we need to be, against global capitalism. We need to be strong enough and unite with other organizations that have share similar goals with us. So, for example, DiEM is an initiator of the Progressive International, but then we work together with people like Jeremy Corbyn, Lula, Bernie Sanders, Vanessa Nakate from Kenya, but there are so many more. I cannot list them. I don't even know them all. It's a big long list. You find it under progressive.international. You find their homepage. A very promising project, I think. And they're also starting to run campaigns. For example, make Amazon pay against this global company, supporting local union building, and so on and so forth. So those are many projects. On diem25.org, you find them all. You will get more information about them. And I want to finish with something, because we're guests here at the Independent Socialists. And socialism is, of course, a word that in Germany, for example, you know, some people use it. It has a negative connotation from the past for a lot of people. And I wanted to quit with a little anecdote. I have been with someone who gave a presentation about our Green New Deal for Europe program at my former workplace. Before I actually started working for DiEM25, I was working for a small consultant company in Berlin. A colleague came and gave a presentation about the Green New Deal for Europe, explaining the whole agenda and how it should be put into place and what are the goals. And then after the meeting, someone raised the question like, I'm wondering, like, this all sounds pretty socialist. Is that a socialist program? And then my colleague was answering, yeah, I guess you could say so. It is basically, you know, socialist ideas put into a new frame and presented as something that we need. And maybe we also, you know, socialism, of course, is a very wide area word. So I think we need to sit down together across borders and write such programs and try then together to put them into place. And that's what DiEM is about. Thanks a lot for listening.
Johannes, thank you very much for that. And you touched on a number of really interesting lines for discussion. The Progressive International I'm particularly interested in. It seems to be something which is desperately needed for people across the globe who are part of a whole range of movements and political groupings need to start to think together. The far right have been doing this and are doing this, and the progressives, the left, have been very weak at doing it. So it's something which hopefully people ask questions. Just to answer a point you raised, we ought to have had a discussion perhaps more before the meeting, but in ISW is already recognized as a DSM within DiEM. We had a discussion some 2 or 3 years ago, and we had a speaker from DiEM, and we decided that we didn't want to form a new group. There's too many small groups floating around, so and we're a relatively small group, but so we in a sense are the spontaneous collective. We could do with, we need to expand it, we need ISW to do more, but in a sense we act as that link currently with DiEM, and we need to strengthen that, I think, over the next period. But I'm going to close this part of the meeting now. If we could take a 5-minute break, if that's okay, for people to just rejuvenate and get a drink or whatever. So if we come back at 8:30, is that okay with everybody? And I'm going to stop the recording now.